"Don't reach for anything unless I tell you to," the officer said, his voice sharp enough to slice through the quiet Texas dusk as red and blue lights pulsed against the windshield, turning Naomi Carter's reflection into something fractured and unreal. Her hands rested calmly on the steering wheel, fingers still, breath measured, while the hum of the cruiser behind her vibrated through the empty two-lane road stretching for miles in both directions, heat still rising off the asphalt even as the sun dipped low. She had been driving just under the speed limit. Windows cracked, a soft gospel station playing low, the paper bag on the passenger seat filled with carefully labeled medication shifting slightly with every stop, each vial wrapped in tissue like something fragile and important, because it was. Naomi blinked once, slow and deliberate, then spoke, her voice steady. "Officer, I'm reaching for my license." Every word chosen with care, every movement intentional, as if the air itself had rules she needed to follow. The second cruiser pulled up beside her, tires crunching gravel, another set of footsteps approaching, heavier this time, the presence of authority multiplying in silence. Naomi's eyes flicked briefly to the side mirror, catching a glimpse of her own face. Tired, composed, unafraid. And for a moment the world narrowed to the small space between her hands and the glove compartment. When she opened it, slowly, the faint scent of antiseptic drifted out, mixing with the warm air, and that was when the paper bag tipped, sliding off the seat in quiet defiance of gravity, hitting the pavement with a soft but final sound, glass tapping against glass before one vial cracked, a thin line spreading across its surface. Naomi's gaze dropped for half a second, just enough to register what had happened, not long enough to break her composure, because the officer's voice came again, tighter now. "Keep your hands where I can see them." And she did, lifting them slightly, palms open, empty, as the last light of day traced the edges of her fingers. Somewhere in the distance, a radio crackled, faint at first, then sharper, cutting through the stillness with a tone that didn't belong to routine traffic stops, a tone that carried urgency, confusion, something unresolved. Naomi didn't react, not outwardly, but something in the air shifted, subtle as a change in pressure before a storm, the kind you feel before you understand it. And as the officer reached for his shoulder mic, his earlier certainty seemed to hesitate, just for a fraction of a second, while Naomi stood beside her car now, the wind brushing against her jacket, her posture unchanged, her presence quiet but unyielding, as if she knew something the rest of them didn't, something that hadn't been spoken yet but was already on its way. The wind shifted slightly, brushing dust across the shoulder of the road as Naomi Carter stood beside her car, her hands still visible, her posture steady, while the officers exchanged a glance that lasted just a second too long, the kind of glance that carried uncertainty without words. Officer Brooks adjusted his stance, one hand resting near his belt, the other pressing the button on his radio, his voice lower now, controlled. "Dispatch, confirm identification." And the reply came back not as routine chatter, but as a clipped tone followed by a pause that stretched in a way that did not belong to ordinary stops. Naomi's eyes moved once toward the broken vial on the ground, a thin line of clear liquid catching the fading sunlight, and for a moment her expression softened, not with fear, but with something quieter, something like concern for what had been lost rather than what might happen next. She shifted her weight slightly, careful, deliberate, the gravel under her shoes making a faint sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness. "Ma'am, stay right there," the second officer said, his voice less certain than before, as if the situation had slipped just outside the boundaries of what he understood. Naomi nodded once, a small motion, respectful, composed, her gaze lifting back to meet them without challenge, without submission, just presence. The radio crackled again, sharper this time, a different voice cutting through, not local, not familiar, carrying a tone that made both officers straighten. Instinctively, "Unit on Highway 47, confirm status immediately." The words precise, measured, leaving no room for delay. Brooks frowned slightly, glancing down at the device as if it had changed in his hand. "This is Highway Patrol, routine stop," he replied. But the answer that followed did not match the question. "Stand by. Do not proceed further." And then silence, heavy and deliberate. Naomi remained still, the wind catching a loose strand of her hair, her face calm in the dimming light, as if she had stepped into this moment long before it arrived. The distant horizon glowed with the last edge of sunset, painting the road in muted gold, and for a brief second everything felt suspended, like the world itself was waiting. One of the officers glanced back at the cruisers, then at Naomi again, his earlier confidence replaced by something harder to name, something closer to doubt. Brooks exhaled slowly, his grip on the radio tightening. "Ma'am, can you explain where you are coming from tonight?" he asked, the question sounding procedural, but the tone no longer carried the same authority. Naomi answered without hesitation, her voice even. "From St. Matthew's Medical Center, I was delivering medication." And her eyes flickered once more toward the broken glass. Not as an excuse, not as a defense. Just as a fact. The radio came alive again, louder now, the urgency unmistakable. "All units hold position. Await further instruction." And this time there was no mistaking it. The shift was real, the kind that moves quietly but changes everything. And as Brooks lowered the radio slightly, his gaze returned to Naomi, studying her not as a suspect, but as a question he had not expected to ask. The silence after the last transmission did not feel empty. It felt intentional, like a door had been closed somewhere far away, but the echo had not reached them yet. And Officer Brooks stood there with the radio still in his hand, staring at it as if it might explain itself, while the second officer shifted his stance again, less certain now, his weight uneven on the gravel. Naomi Carter did not move. Her hands still open at her sides, her breathing calm, the fading light soft against her face. And there was something in that stillness that did not match the tension around her, something grounded, steady, as if she was not waiting for permission to exist in that moment. Brooks cleared his throat slightly, the sound small but noticeable in the quiet, and he stepped closer, not aggressive, but cautious, his voice lower now. "You said you were delivering medication," and Naomi nodded once, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. "Yes, sir, for a child who cannot leave the hospital." Her tone even, not defensive, not pleading, just factual, and the words seemed to land differently this time, not dismissed, not ignored, but held in the space between them. Brooks glanced down at the broken vial again, the liquid now spreading thinner across the pavement, catching the last trace of daylight, and for a brief moment his expression shifted, something like recognition, or maybe discomfort. Before he looked back up, the radio crackled again, louder than before, and this time the voice carried a weight that neither officer could ignore. "Unit on Highway 47. Confirm subject identity immediately and do not escalate." The phrasing precise, controlled, but unmistakably urgent, and Brooks responded quickly, almost reflexively. "Identity pending, subject compliant." His words sharper than before, but the edge of certainty was gone. Naomi stood quietly, the wind brushing past her jacket, the road stretching empty behind her, and in that stillness she seemed unchanged, unaffected by the rising tension, as if she had already accepted whatever outcome might come, and that calm began to press against the officers in a way they could not easily explain. The second officer glanced toward Brooks again, his voice lower, almost hesitant. "This is not standard," and Brooks did not answer right away, his gaze fixed on Naomi, studying her now not as a suspect, but as something unresolved, something that did not fit the pattern he had expected when the lights first came on. The sky darkened another shade, the sun nearly gone, and the flashing lights painted everything in alternating color, red then blue then red again, each pulse stretching the moment longer. Naomi's eyes moved once more to the broken glass, then back up, and she spoke softly. "May I secure the remaining medication?" The question simple, controlled, but it carried a quiet urgency that did not come from fear, and Brooks hesitated, just for a second, before nodding once, the gesture small but significant. As she bent slightly, careful, deliberate, the radio erupted again, this time with no pause, no uncertainty, only command. "All units hold position. Senior command is initiating direct contact," and the words seemed to settle over the scene like a weight, pressing down on every movement, every breath, as Brooks straightened fully now, his posture shifting from authority to attention, And for the first time since the stop began, it was clear that whatever was coming next was no longer in his control. The command did not fade this time. It held, sharp and present in the air, as Officer Brooks lowered the radio slowly, his posture no longer relaxed but rigid, almost formal, like something deep in his training had just been triggered without explanation, while the second officer took a step back without realizing he had moved, his eyes shifting between Naomi Carter and the device on Brooks' shoulder, as if trying to reconcile two different realities. Naomi remained where she was, one hand lightly securing the remaining vials inside the paper bag, her movements careful, deliberate, as if the fragile contents mattered more than the tension surrounding her. And when she straightened again, the wind carried a faint rustle through the dry grass along the roadside, the only sound that felt natural in a moment that had quietly become anything but. Brooks exhaled slowly, then spoke, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier edge. "Ma'am, I am going to need you to stay right there." But the instructions sounded different this time, less like a command and more like a request shaped by uncertainty. And Naomi gave a small nod, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged. The radio lit up again, not with static, not with delay, but with immediate clarity, a new voice cutting through, measured and unmistakably authoritative. "This is Senior Command, patching through a secure line now." And both officers straightened instinctively, their attention snapping to the device as if pulled by something unseen. For a brief second, there was silence, not empty but controlled, like a breath being held across distance. And then the screen on the patrol unit mounted near the dashboard flickered to life, its glow faint but unmistakable against the darkening sky, casting a pale reflection across the windshield and onto the gravel beside Naomi's car. Brooks stepped toward the cruiser, his boots crunching softly, his movements slower than before, as if each step required confirmation, while the second officer followed half a pace behind, neither of them speaking now, neither of them fully in control of what was unfolding. Naomi watched them, not with fear, not with anticipation, but with a quiet awareness that seemed to settle deeper into the moment, her shoulders relaxed, her hands still visible, her posture unchanged as the light from the screen reflected faintly in her eyes. The connection stabilized, the image sharpening just enough to reveal a figure on the other side, not fully clear yet, but distinct in presence, uniformed, composed, and the tone of the room on that distant end carried through even without words, disciplined, precise, unmistakably military. Brooks stopped just short of the door, his hand hovering near the handle, his earlier authority now replaced by something closer to hesitation. And when the voice finally came through, it did not raise in volume. It did not need to. "Officer, confirm the identity of the individual you have detained." The words calm, controlled, but carrying a weight that pressed into the space between them. Brooks glanced back at Naomi, really looked at her this time, as if seeing her for the first time without assumption, and his answer came slower than before. "Name provided is Naomi Carter." And the briefest pause followed, not long, but long enough to shift everything, before the voice on the line responded, steady and unmistakable, "Maintain your position. Do not proceed further." And as the words settled, the flashing lights continued their rhythm, red then blue then red again, but the meaning of the moment had already changed, quietly, completely, and there was no going back. The weight of the command lingered in the air long after the voice fell silent, pressing down on the scene with a quiet authority that neither officer could ignore. And Officer Brooks stood there beside the cruiser, his hand now resting against the door instead of reaching for it, his posture caught somewhere between action and restraint, while the glow from the screen reflected faintly across his face, revealing something that had not been there before. Not doubt exactly, but a shift, a crack. In the certainty he had carried into this stop, the second officer remained a step behind, his arms no longer firm at his sides, his stance looser, uncertain, as if waiting for direction that was no longer coming from within the scene itself. Naomi Carter stood where she had been, the paper bag now held securely in her hands, the remaining vials quiet inside, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze steady. And there was something about the way she held herself that did not match the tension around her. Something grounded, something that did not need to prove anything to anyone. The wind picked up slightly, brushing across the open road, carrying with it the distant hum of passing air and the faint echo of the cruiser's engine idling behind them. And for a moment it felt like time had slowed, stretched thin between what had happened and what was about to be revealed. Brooks finally moved, not toward Naomi, but toward the open door of the cruiser, leaning just enough to look at the screen more clearly, his eyes narrowing as the image sharpened. The figure on the other end, now unmistakable in uniform, posture straight, presence controlled, and the silence from that side of the line carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. "Officer." The voice came again, calm, deliberate, each word placed with precision. "Step back from the vehicle and maintain visual distance." And Brooks obeyed without hesitation this time, stepping back slowly, his boots crunching against the gravel. The movement small but significant, the kind that marked a shift in control that could not be reversed. The second officer followed instinctively, mirroring the step without needing to be told, both of them now positioned not as enforcers, but as observers within a situation that had quietly outgrown them. Naomi watched this change without expression, her face calm, her breathing even, as if she had been here before in some form, as if she understood that moments like this did not arrive loudly. They unfolded piece by piece until everything looked different without anyone noticing when it changed. Brooks glanced at her again, and this time there was no assumption in his eyes, only recognition that something about her presence did not align with the way this stop had begun. And when he spoke, his voice had softened, not in weakness, but in awareness. "Ma'am, you may remain where you are." The words careful, respectful, and Naomi gave a small nod, not as submission, but as acknowledgement. The screen inside the cruiser flickered slightly, the signal stabilizing further, and the figure on the other end leaned forward just enough for the light to catch the insignia on his uniform, the detail sharp now, undeniable, and Brooks felt his breath catch slightly, not in fear, but in the realization that whatever he thought this moment was, it had already become something else entirely. The road remained empty, the sky now deepening into evening, the flashing lights continuing their steady rhythm. But the meaning behind them had shifted, and as the voice prepared to speak again, the space between everyone present felt charged with something that could no longer be undone. The air seemed to settle into a strange stillness, not empty, but heavy, like something unseen had taken its place between them. And Naomi Carter stood quietly beside her car, the paper bag held close against her side, her fingers gently securing the remaining vials as if they were the only fragile thing that mattered in a moment that had already grown far beyond her. The flashing lights continued their steady rhythm, red then blue then red again, washing over her face, over the officers, over the cracked glass on the ground. And yet the urgency that had filled the scene earlier had softened into something quieter, something more deliberate. Officer Brooks did not move closer again. He remained where he was, a few steps back, his shoulders squared but no longer rigid, his attention fixed not on control but on understanding, while the second officer shifted slightly behind him, his earlier confidence now replaced by a careful stillness, as if any sudden movement might disrupt whatever was unfolding. The screen inside the cruiser glowed steadily now, the figure on the other end fully visible, composed. Uniform precise, posture unshaken, and though no one spoke for a moment, the presence carried through clearly, filling the space without needing volume. Naomi's gaze lowered briefly, not in submission, but in quiet thought, as she noticed a small drop of liquid sliding from the edge of the broken vial onto the pavement, catching the last hint of daylight before disappearing into the dust, and she inhaled slowly, a breath that grounded her, a breath that seemed to hold more weight than the tension around her. The wind brushed past again, softer now, carrying the faint scent of warm asphalt and distant earth, and for a moment it felt like the road itself was waiting, suspended between past and what came next. Brooks cleared his throat gently, not out of authority but out of uncertainty, and his voice when it came was measured, careful. "Ma'am, you mentioned this medication is urgent." And Naomi lifted her eyes to meet his, her expression calm, steady. "Yes, sir, it is for a child who is waiting." Her words simple, but they carried a quiet gravity that settled into the space between them. The second officer glanced down at the ground again, at the broken vial, then back at Naomi, and something in his posture softened, a realization forming without being spoken. Inside the cruiser, the faint hum of electronics blended with the low static of the open line, and the figure on the screen remained still, observing, listening, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, her movements still controlled, still respectful, and yet there was no tension in her, no urgency in her gestures, only a quiet patience, as if she trusted that what needed to happen would happen without force. Brooks took a slow breath, the kind that steadies more than just the body, and for the first time since the lights had come on, he lowered his gaze for a brief second, not in defeat, but in reflection, before lifting it again to Naomi with a different kind of awareness. The silence returned, but it was no longer the same silence as before. It was no longer filled with suspicion or control. It was filled with something else, something closer to recognition, and as the faint glow of the screen flickered once more, signaling that the next words were about to come, every person present felt it, the quiet shift that meant nothing would remain the way it had been just minutes ago. The voice on the screen did not rush, it did not rise. It simply arrived with a calm authority that settled over the road like a final piece falling into place. "Officer Brooks," it said, precise and unmistakable, and Brooks straightened instinctively, his response immediate. "Yes, sir," his tone no longer carrying assumption, only attention. The figure on the screen leaned forward slightly, the light catching the insignia on his uniform, sharp, defined, leaving no room for doubt, and when he spoke again, each word landed with quiet certainty. "The individual you have stopped is Mrs. Naomi Carter." A brief pause followed, not for effect, but for clarity. "She is under my protection," and the meaning of that statement moved through the space without needing explanation. Brooks felt his breath catch for a fraction of a second, not from fear, but from recognition, the kind that shifts understanding in an instant. And his gaze moved back to Naomi, really seeing her now, not as a question, not as a situation, but as a person he had misjudged from the start. The second officer shifted beside him, his posture tightening again, but not in control, in awareness, his earlier uncertainty now replaced by something closer to realization. Naomi stood where she had been, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, as if the words had not elevated her, only revealed what had always been true. And she did not step forward, did not speak, she simply remained. The general's voice continued, calm, controlled, but carrying a deeper weight now. "You will ensure she is able to continue her route without further delay." And Brooks nodded instinctively before remembering the line was visual as well as audio. "Yes, sir," his voice firm, but quieter than before. The wind moved again, brushing past the roadside, lifting a small edge of dust that drifted briefly before settling back down. And the flashing lights continued their rhythm, but now they felt out of place, like something that belonged to a moment that had already passed. Brooks took a step forward, then stopped, recalibrating, choosing his movement more carefully this time. And when he spoke to Naomi, his voice had changed, not in volume, but in tone. "Ma'am," he said, the word deliberate, respectful. "You are free to go." And the sentence carried more than permission, it carried acknowledgement. Naomi met his gaze, her eyes calm, her expression soft but unwavering, and she gave a small nod, not as acceptance of authority, but as recognition of the shift that had taken place. Behind Brooks, the second officer glanced once more at the broken vial on the ground, then at Naomi, and something in his face tightened slightly, not from tension, but from understanding what that small detail represented. The screen inside the cruiser dimmed slightly as the connection held, the general still present, still watching, but no longer needing to speak, because what needed to be said had already been understood. Naomi turned slightly toward her car, the movement unhurried, her hand steady as she reached for the door, and for a brief moment the scene held its breath again, not from uncertainty, but from the quiet weight of realization that had settled over everyone there. The road stretched ahead of her, empty and waiting, the last light of day fading into night, and as the moment closed around them, it was clear that nothing about this stop would be remembered the way it began. Naomi's hand paused for just a second on the car door, not out of hesitation, but because something in the moment still felt unfinished, not externally, but internally, like a quiet thread that had not yet been acknowledged, and she turned her head slightly, her gaze moving back to Officer Brooks, who remained standing a few feet away, his posture still, his expression no longer guarded but reflective, as if he was standing inside the realization of what had just happened rather than outside of it. The flashing lights continued to pulse behind him, softer now against the deepening blue of the evening sky, and the road, once tense and confined, seemed to open again, stretching forward without resistance. Naomi took a slow breath, then spoke, her voice calm, steady, not raised, but clear enough to carry. "Officer." And Brooks met her eyes immediately, his attention focused, present. "It is not about who is on the other end of that call," she continued, her tone gentle, but firm in a way that did not need force. "It is about how you see the person standing in front of you before that call ever happens." The words settled into the space between them, not as accusation, not as anger, but as something quieter, something harder to ignore. Brooks did not respond right away, his jaw tightening slightly, not defensively, but as if holding back a reaction he had not fully processed yet, and the second officer shifted beside him, his gaze lowering briefly before returning to Naomi, both of them standing in a silence that now carried meaning instead of uncertainty. Naomi did not wait for a reply. She did not need one, her point already made in a way that did not demand acknowledgement to be true, and she turned back toward her car, opening the door slowly, the soft click of the handle sounding louder than expected in the quiet. She placed the paper bag carefully on the passenger seat, adjusting it slightly so the remaining vials would not move again, her hands steady, deliberate. Then she paused once more, her eyes briefly catching the reflection of the flashing lights in the side mirror, a reminder of what had just unfolded and what it had revealed. Behind her, Brooks finally exhaled, a long, controlled breath, the kind that came after understanding something that could not be undone, and he glanced down at the ground where the broken vial still lay, the thin line of liquid now nearly gone, absorbed into the dust, leaving behind only a faint mark that would disappear completely with time. The second officer stepped back another inch, almost unconsciously, creating more space, not out of procedure, but out of respect that had not been there before. Inside the cruiser, the screen dimmed further, the presence on the other end no longer speaking, no longer needing to. The silence from that side now carrying closure instead of tension. Naomi settled into the driver's seat, her movements unhurried, composed, and as she reached for the steering wheel, the engine humming softly to life. The road ahead seemed clearer, not because anything had changed physically, but because something unseen had shifted. Brooks stepped back fully now, clearing the path without being asked, his eyes still on the car, his expression quiet, reflective, as if the moment would stay with him long after the lights were turned off. Naomi glanced forward, her hands resting lightly on the wheel, and without another word, she eased the car back onto the road, the tires rolling smoothly over the asphalt, leaving behind the flashing lights, the stillness, and the silence that now belonged to the officers standing there, unchanged in place, but not unchanged within. The road swallowed the sound of Naomi Carter's car as it moved farther into the night, the soft hum of the engine fading until it became part of the distance itself, and the flashing red and blue lights behind her continued for a few seconds longer before Officer Brooks finally reached up and switched them off, the sudden absence of color leaving the highway dim and still, illuminated only by the fading glow of dusk and the faint headlights of passing time. He stood there for a moment, unmoving, the radio silent at his shoulder, the screen inside the cruiser now dark, as if the authority that had filled the space earlier had withdrawn just as quietly as it arrived. The second officer shifted beside him, glancing once down the road where Naomi had disappeared, then back at the ground near the shoulder, where the broken vial remained, a small, almost invisible mark left behind on the asphalt, its presence subtle but undeniable. Brooks stepped forward slowly, his boots pressing into the gravel with a muted crunch, and he crouched slightly, his eyes fixed on that faint trace, the place where something important had been lost without protest, without resistance, and for a moment he did not reach for it. He simply looked, as if trying to understand what it represented beyond the physical. The wind moved again, cooler now, carrying the quiet weight of evening, and the road stretched out before them, unchanged in appearance but different in meaning, as if it had witnessed something that would not leave with the passing of time. Brooks straightened, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defined by authority alone, and he glanced toward his partner, who met his gaze briefly before looking away, both of them aware that no report, no procedure, no routine explanation would fully capture what had just unfolded. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was reflective, filled with thoughts that did not need to be spoken to be understood. And as Brooks reached for the door of the cruiser, his hand paused for just a second, not from hesitation, but from awareness, the kind that lingers after something shifts internally in a way that cannot be undone. He opened the door and sat down slowly, the familiar interior of the vehicle feeling different now, not because it had changed, but because he had, even if only slightly, even if only enough to notice. The second officer remained outside. For another moment, his gaze still on the road, as if expecting something else to appear, some final confirmation, but none came, only the steady quiet of night settling in. Eventually, he moved as well, stepping into the passenger seat, the door closing with a soft, final sound, and for a brief second neither of them spoke, the engine idling, the world outside still. Brooks started the vehicle, the dashboard lights flickering on, casting a soft glow across his hands as they rested on the wheel. And he looked forward, not chasing the car that had already gone, not trying to return to the moment before, but simply sitting with the space that remained, the silence that followed, and the understanding that some moments do not end when they are over. They stay, quiet and unseen, shaping what comes next in ways that cannot be measured, only felt.